February 1945. In a grand palace on the Crimean coast, three men sat across from each other, holding the fate of millions in their hands. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president who could barely walk, hunched in his wheelchair with his mouth hanging open. Winston Churchill, Britain's bulldog prime minister, chain-smoking and growing increasingly anxious. And Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator who had already murdered more people than Hitler, calm and confident, knowing he held all the cards. 8 days of negotiations, fueled by caviar and champagne, would seal the doom of Eastern Europe for nearly half a century. Roosevelt would return to America and tell Congress he had achieved peace. 2 months later, he would be dead. And while American families celebrated victory over Nazi Germany, Soviet secret police were already dragging Polish resistance fighters from their homes, executing them in forests, shipping them to frozen death camps in Siberia. The promises made at Yalta were not just broken, they were lies from the very beginning. The journey to Yalta itself should have been a warning. Roosevelt traveled 14,000 miles to reach this godforsaken resort on the Black Sea. Why? Because Stalin refused to go anywhere else. The Soviet dictator claimed his doctors forbade long trips, that his health could not withstand air travel. It was all nonsense. Stalin simply wanted to show who was really in charge. He made the sick, dying American president come to him. When Churchill's physician, Lord Morin, first laid eyes on Roosevelt at Yalta, he was horrified. He wrote that the president was a very sick man with only months to live. Roosevelt's blood pressure during the conference reached a staggering 260 over 150, numbers that would make any doctor's hair stand on end. His hands shook uncontrollably. He had lost a dangerous amount of weight. During meetings, observers reported, he would simply sit with his mouth open, staring straight ahead, as if he were not taking things in. Churchill's doctor was not the only one to notice. Future Secretary of State James Burns, who attended the conference, would later write that, so far as he could see, the president had made little preparation for the conference. William Harriman, the American special envoy to Europe, observed that Roosevelt did not have the strength to be quite as stubborn as he liked to be. Churchill himself complained bitterly to his doctor, saying the president is behaving very badly. He won't take any interest in what we are trying to do. But the truth was even worse than Churchill knew. Modern medical research has revealed that Roosevelt was not just sick. He was suffering from what neurologists call complex partial seizures, brief episodes where he would lose consciousness while appearing to be awake and functioning. These blackouts, lasting anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes, were happening regularly at Yalta. Dozens of observers witnessed them. The president of the United States was negotiating the future of the world while periodically blacking out, completely unaware of what was being discussed around him. And Stalin knew it. The Soviet dictator had bugged every room where the British and Americans stayed. His agents listened to every private conversation. They knew Roosevelt was dying. They knew Churchill was desperate. Stalin played them both like violins. The official topic at Yalta was the reorganization of post-war Europe. The war against Nazi Germany was nearly won. Soviet forces stood just 40 miles from Berlin. American and British troops were closing in from the west. The question was not if Germany would fall, but what would happen after. At the center of the debate was Poland, the nation for which Britain had originally gone to war in 1939. By February 1945, the Red Army occupied most of Polish territory. Stalin had already installed a communist puppet government in the city of Lublin. Roosevelt and Churchill wanted free elections, democratic governments, self-determination for the Polish people. They fought hard for these principles, or at least they thought they did. Here is what actually happened. Stalin promised free elections in Poland. He promised to allow democratic participation in the new Polish government. He promised that the Polish people would have the right to choose their own destiny. In the Declaration on Liberated Europe, signed by all three leaders, they pledged that liberated peoples would be able to create democratic institutions of their own choice through free elections. The words sounded beautiful. Roosevelt believed them. On March 1, 1945, speaking to the U.S. Congress, he declared with absolute confidence, "I come from the Crimea with a firm belief that we have made a start on the road to a world of peace." 2 months later, Roosevelt was dead from a massive brain hemorrhage. Stalin had never intended to keep a single promise. His foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, had expressed concerns that the Yalta Agreement's wording might interfere with Soviet plans. Stalin's response was chilling and direct. "Never mind," he said. "We'll do it our own way later." And they did. While Roosevelt was still alive, while he was still telling Congress about peace and democracy, Soviet forces were already hunting down Polish resistance fighters. The Home Army, Poland's underground resistance movement, had fought the Nazis for 6 brutal years. They had sabotaged German supply lines, provided crucial intelligence to the Allies, liberated cities ahead of Soviet advances. They were heroes, and Stalin marked them all for death. The pattern was the same across occupied Poland. Soviet forces would call Home Army units to come forward, promising cooperation against the retreating Germans. The Poles, believing in Allied unity, would emerge from hiding. Then came the arrests, mass deportations, summary executions. In one operation in June 1945, called the Augustov Roundup, Soviet NKVD forces captured more than 2,000 former Home Army soldiers. 600 of them disappeared forever, presumed murdered and buried in unmarked graves somewhere in Russia. Their bodies have never been found. Polish resistance fighters who had helped liberate cities like Vilnius and Lwów from the Nazis watched in horror as the Soviets immediately turned on them. After assisting Soviet units with intelligence and military operations, Home Army troops found themselves arrested, interrogated, tortured. Thousands were sent to gulags in Siberia. Many were simply shot. On March 27, 1945, less than a month after Yalta, Soviet General Ivan Serov invited the leaders of the Polish underground state to a conference. He promised safe passage, guaranteed their security, said they would discuss forming a unified Polish government. It was a trap. 16 Polish leaders, including the commander of the Home Army and the Deputy Prime Minister of Poland, accepted the invitation. They were immediately arrested, beaten, and transported to Moscow's infamous Lubyanka prison. For 3 months, they endured brutal interrogation and torture. The Soviets fabricated charges, collaboration with Nazis, terrorism against the Red Army, planning military alliances with Germany. All lies. In June 1945, Stalin put them on trial in Moscow, a show trial designed to destroy the credibility of the Polish resistance. Western observers attended. They saw the coerced confessions, the lack of defense witnesses, the complete absence of real evidence. And they did nothing. When the Polish government in exile protested, demanding the prisoners' release, the Soviets initially denied even holding them. When they finally admitted to the arrests in early May, Stalin assured American envoy Harry Hopkins that the sentences would not be high. On June 21, 1945, the verdicts came down. The commander of the Home Army received 10 years. The deputy prime minister got 8 years and would die in a Soviet prison, probably murdered, 2 weeks before his sentence was supposed to end. Other leaders received shorter sentences, but the message was clear. Poland belonged to Stalin now. On July 6, 1945, the United Kingdom and the United States officially withdrew support for the legitimate Polish government in exile. The Polish forces that had fought alongside Britain throughout the war, the pilots who had defended British skies in the Battle of Britain, the soldiers who had liberated Monte Cassino in Italy, suddenly found themselves betrayed. Many refused to return to Poland, knowing what awaited them. Britain eventually had to pass the Polish Resettlement Act of 1947, its first mass immigration law, because tens of thousands of Polish soldiers chose exile over returning to Soviet occupation. But the betrayal of Poland was only the beginning. At Yalta, Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed to something even more horrific, something that would haunt the Western Allies for generations. They had promised Stalin that all Soviet citizens in Western hands would be returned to Soviet control. All of them, regardless of their wishes. This became known as Operation Keelhaul. Between 1945 and 1947, Allied forces forcibly repatriated between 2 and 5 million Soviet nationals. These were not all willing returnees happy to go home. Many were prisoners of war who had been captured by the Germans. Others were forced laborers who had been shipped to Germany to work in factories. Still others were refugees who had fled Stalin's regime. And some were soldiers who had fought against the Soviets, believing they were liberating their homeland from tyranny. The scenes at the repatriation camps were nightmarish. Soviet citizens realized what awaited them, and resisted with desperate fury. They rioted, they built barricades, they attacked guards with their bare hands. Some bit into each other's veins, preferring death by blood loss to return to Stalin. Others jumped from moving trains, mothers clutching infants, choosing instant death over slow torture in Soviet prison camps. American and British soldiers, ordered to force these people onto trains and ships bound for the Soviet Union, watched in horror as prisoners impaled themselves on broken glass, hanged themselves from barracks beams, anything to avoid going back. At Fort Dix, New Jersey, about 200 Soviet nationals who had been captured in German uniforms were promised they would never be sent back. They were lied to. When American military authorities tried to force them onto a Soviet ship, the prisoners resisted violently. Eventually, they were drugged into unconsciousness and shipped back while in a comatose state. When historian Julius Epstein tried years later to access government records of this incident, he was told the documents required indefinite maintenance of their current high-security classification. The truth was buried. In Europe, the forced repatriations continued for years. British historian Nikolai Tolstoy described American soldiers returning to camp after delivering a group of prisoners to Soviet authorities. The Americans returned to Platling visibly shamefaced, Tolstoy wrote. Before their departure from the rendezvous in the forest, many had seen rows of bodies already hanging from the branches of nearby trees. Though some historians dispute Tolstoy's account, declassified documents and eyewitness testimony confirm the essential truth. British officials who delivered Soviet prisoners to a port in the White Sea reported witnessing rough treatment and hearing automatic gunfire once the prisoners were out of sight. Everyone knew what was happening, but Operation Keelhaul continued. Stalin's treatment of returned Soviet citizens was systematic and merciless. He considered anyone who had been captured by the Germans, anyone who had worked for the Germans, anyone who had fled to the West, to be a traitor. In 1940, Stalin had issued Order Number 270, declaring that Soviet soldiers had a duty to fight to the death. Surrender was betrayal. Never mind that millions of Soviet soldiers had been encircled and overwhelmed by superior German forces. Never mind that starvation and impossible conditions made resistance futile. Stalin demanded death or victory, nothing else. So, when these Soviet citizens returned, they faced a brutal screening process and special filtration camps. About 70 to 80% of civilians were eventually released to their home regions, but former prisoners of war fared far worse. Between 15 and 30% were sent to forced labor camps in the Gulag or to special settlements, often for 5 to 10 years. Some were executed outright. Official Soviet figures from 1946 reported processing over 4 million returnees through more than 100 such camps. Independent estimates suggest even higher numbers of people sent to forced labor. The Western Allies knew this would happen. They knew Stalin viewed these people as traitors. They knew most faced death, torture, or slavery. And they shipped them back anyway, because Roosevelt and Churchill had promised Stalin at Yalta that they would. Why? The official reason was that Stalin held thousands of American and British prisoners of war who had been liberated by Soviet forces advancing through Eastern Europe. The Western Allies wanted their men back, so they made a deal. We'll give you your citizens, you give us ours. But there was a crucial difference. American and British prisoners wanted to go home. Soviet prisoners did not. The Americans and British were returning to freedom and parades. The Soviets were returning to gulags and firing squads. Yet the Western democracies enforced this devil's bargain, with tanks and bayonets and drugs. Some prisoners escaped Operation Keelhaul. The 14th Waffen Grenadier Division, recruited from Ukrainians, was not repatriated, officially because the region they came from had belonged to Poland before 1939, but really because British intelligence wanted to use them for future anti-Soviet operations. In 1947, Britain granted the entire division asylum, but these were exceptions. Most prisoners had nowhere to run. The legacy of Yalta spread across all of Eastern Europe like a plague. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and East Germany, Soviet forces installed communist governments. The free elections promised at Yalta never happened. Where elections were held, they were rigged. Opposition parties were suppressed. Their leaders arrested or murdered. Newspapers were taken over. Churches were persecuted. Secret police networks spread terror through every level of society. On March 5, 1946, barely a year after Yalta, Winston Churchill delivered a speech in Fulton, Missouri, that would define an era. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he declared, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and, in some cases, increasing measure of control from Moscow. The Iron Curtain would stand for 45 years. 45 years of tyranny, of secret police raids in the night, of show trials and executions, of families divided by barbed wire and minefields, of desperate people shot while trying to escape to freedom, of entire nations held hostage to Stalin's paranoia and his successor's determination to maintain the empire he had built. The promises of Yalta were broken before the ink had dried. Stalin never had any intention of allowing free elections in Poland or anywhere else in his sphere of influence. Churchill and Roosevelt had secured paper promises that meant nothing because they had no way to enforce them. By the time of Yalta, Soviet troops already occupied most of Eastern Europe. As Stalin himself liked to say, whoever occupies a territory also imposes on it his own social system. The Red Army was not going anywhere, and without American willingness to go to war against their recent ally, there was nothing the West could do to stop Soviet domination. But could Roosevelt have done more? Some historians argue that his declining health seriously impaired his negotiating ability. Others point out that by the time of Yalta, the strategic situation left Roosevelt with few options. Soviet forces already controlled the territory. The British were exhausted. The Americans still faced a brutal war against Japan and desperately wanted Soviet help. Roosevelt also did not yet know whether the atomic bomb would work. Without it, invading Japan promised to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. Soviet entry into the Pacific War seemed essential. Yet Roosevelt made critical mistakes even within these constraints. He could have been more skeptical of Stalin's promises. He could have demanded concrete mechanisms for enforcing free elections. He could have used American economic leverage more effectively. The Soviet Union desperately needed American aid for post-war reconstruction. Stalin himself admitted that without American lend-lease machinery, the Soviets would have lost the war. Roosevelt might have threatened to cut off aid unless Stalin honored his commitments. He did not. Churchill tried to be tougher, but he too made terrible compromises. In October 1904, months before Yalta, Churchill had traveled to Moscow and made a secret deal with Stalin, dividing the Balkans into spheres of influence. Greece for Britain, Romania for the Soviets, Yugoslavia and Hungary split 50-50. This cynical bargain set the stage for Yalta's larger betrayals. Churchill also agreed, along with Roosevelt, to the forced repatriation policy that would doom millions to death and slavery. The consequences of Yalta shaped world history for nearly half a century. The Cold War began not at Yalta itself, but in the months after, when it became clear that Stalin had no intention of honoring the agreements. The division of Europe led directly to the Berlin airlift, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and countless proxy wars where millions died. The nuclear arms race consumed trillions of dollars and brought humanity to the brink of extinction multiple times. And in the nations behind the Iron Curtain, entire generations grew up under totalitarian rule. In Poland, former Home Army fighters were hunted down and murdered well into the 1960s. The last Polish resistance fighter, Józef Franciszek, was killed in a shootout with communist police in 1963, 18 years after the war ended. In Hungary, Soviet tanks crushed an uprising in 1956, killing thousands. In Czechoslovakia, Soviet forces invaded in 1968 to destroy the Prague Spring, a brief moment when it seemed freedom might return. In East Germany, the government built a wall through the heart of Berlin in 1961 to stop its citizens from fleeing to freedom. Those who tried to escape were shot. The people trapped behind the Iron Curtain never forgot Yalta. For Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, and others, Yalta symbolized Western betrayal, the moment when Roosevelt and Churchill sacrificed Eastern Europe to buy peace with Stalin. The Poles called Yalta the fourth partition of their nation, comparing it to the times when Poland had been carved up and destroyed by neighboring empires in the 18th and 19th centuries. The bitterness was deep and justified. Only in 1989, 44 years after Yalta, did the Iron Curtain finally begin to fall. The Soviet Empire collapsed, not from external force, but from internal rot. The communist system that Stalin had imposed could not deliver prosperity or freedom. When Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev finally relaxed the grip of terror, the whole structure came tumbling down. Poland led the way, with the Solidarity movement showing that workers could organize against communist rule. Hungary opened its borders. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989 in a wave of peaceful revolution. One by one, the nation Stalin had enslaved won back their freedom, but the cost of those 45 years can never be calculated. Millions dead in gulags, in show trials, in desperate escape attempts. Entire economies ruined by communist central planning. Cultures suppressed, languages banned, histories rewritten, families torn apart, lives destroyed, dreams crushed under the weight of totalitarian control. All because three men met in a palace in the Crimea in February 1945, and one of them, a dying American president, chose to trust a Soviet dictator who had already murdered millions and would murder millions more. Roosevelt went to his grave believing he had achieved peace. He never knew how completely Stalin had played him. He never saw the arrests, the deportations, the show trials, the forced repatriations, the descent of the Iron Curtain. 2 months after Yalta, on April 12, 1945, while sitting for a portrait at Warm Springs, Georgia, Roosevelt suddenly said, "I have a terrific headache." Then he collapsed. 2 hours later, he was dead, killed by a massive cerebral hemorrhage, his blood pressure in excess of 300 over 190. The man who had led America through the Depression and most of World War II, the man who believed he could build a peaceful world order with Stalin's cooperation, died without ever seeing the consequences of Yalta. History remembers Yalta as one of the great diplomatic failures of the 20th century. The conference where Eastern Europe was lost, where millions were consigned to decades of slavery and oppression, where Western leaders chose compromise with evil over confrontation. The promises made at Yalta were not just broken. They were illusions from the start, built on Roosevelt's failing health, Churchill's exhaustion, and Stalin's ruthless understanding that whoever controls territory controls destiny. 45 years. 45 years of tyranny. 45 years of secret police terror. 45 years of families divided by walls and barbed wire. 45 years of people dying for freedom. All because in February 1945, in a palace on the Black Sea, Franklin Roosevelt trusted Joseph Stalin, and Eastern Europe paid the price until 1980. If you found this exploration of one of history's most consequential diplomatic disasters compelling, please like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments below about what Roosevelt and Churchill should have done differently, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world.